Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Guys, we went deep for this breakdown, reading books, watching interviews, going over the movie a million times frame by frame, and we are insanely proud of this video. Before we break down the movie, though, I do want to talk about the origins of this film and the films that inspired the filmmakers. So the theme of Winter Soldier is freedom versus fear, as embodied by the leads of this movie, Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes. For decades, the government used Steve as a symbol of freedom, while it was secretly using the Winter Soldier as an instrument of fear. But the title, The Winter Soldier, is actually misleading. It seems like it's about Bucky. After all, he was created in a Siberian prison and put back on ice over the decades. But go back to the original quote by Thomas Paine, who was writing about the hardships of the soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he, the Winter Soldier that stands by it now, deserves the love and the thanks of man and woman. So, thematically, Steve Rogers is actually the Winter Soldier because he always fights in the darkest of times. He stands by his friends even when they turn out to be brainwashed assassins. Now, the story is based on the Winter Soldier Captain America arc by Ed Brubaker and Steve Epting.
Put it on the list.
Now, I should note that for years there was this unofficial rule that only two characters were able to stay dead: Uncle Ben and Bucky. See, Bucky was Steve's teen sidekick in the 1940s, but when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee brought Steve back in the 1960s, it was revealed that Bucky died on his final mission. So for decades, it was always thought that Steve Rogers was a better character if he always felt this remorse and guilt over Bucky's death. So in the book The Reign of Marvel Studios, co-director Joe Russo said what Ed Brubaker did was so brilliant. He completely deconstructed the mythology and made him very relevant. And by putting him in an espionage genre, he married it to a genre that could support the character and make the character more interesting. Today, Joe and Anthony Russo are considered superhero royalty after directing Winter Soldier, Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. But when they were hired, they seemed like an oddball choice. The two were famously known for directing sitcoms, for instance 14 episodes of Arrested Development and a staggering 34 episodes of Community, including the epic paintball two-parter, A Fist of Paintballs, and For a Few Paintballs More.
Well, I'm out. We lost.
Now, Kevin Feige was a big fan of those two episodes, and he hired the Russos based on how well they executed the action scenes. And it turned out that TV directors are a perfect fit for the Marvel Studios system. The Russos already knew how to work within a larger system, where Kevin Feige served as a kind of showrunner of Marvel Studios. Now, Feige and producer Nate Moore told the writers, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, that they wanted the movie to feel like a 1970s conspiracy thriller. Or what's that? So, in the 1970s, this was a very popular genre. After Watergate and the Vietnam War, people felt like they couldn't trust their government. So many films reflected this distrust by having one lone hero expose a corrupt conspiracy within the system. So Marcus and McFeely took direct inspiration from films like Marathon Man, where Dustin Hoffman gets wrapped up in a mystery with a Nazi war criminal. In fact, when the Russos met with their editor, Jeff Ford, Ford asked them to name a couple of movies that inspired them so he could get a sense of the stylistics of the film. And the Russos said that, one of the movies they were thinking about is the Francis Ford Coppola classic, The Conversation. So Jeff Ford immediately replied, "You don't have to name any others. I'm in. We're good. Let's get some drinks." What's The Conversation? So it's about a man named Harry Call who is paid to spy on people. And as the film goes on, he gradually becomes more paranoid that he is actually the one being watched. Now you can see the influence of The Conversation, for instance, in the Winter Soldier elevator scene. Except in the Winter Soldier, tension ratchets up as people enter the elevator, and in The Conversation, it becomes more tense as Call is left alone with the woman he is spying on. Now throughout this video, we are going to talk about the litany of films that influenced the Winter Soldier, but the key influence on the film was Sidney Pollack's 3 Days of the Condor. Marcus and McFeely mapped the entire plot of Winter Soldier so closely to that film that they actually nicknamed their early draft 3 Days of Captain America. So I'm going to go through all of these similarities now, or else I'll just keep referencing them throughout the video. The movies are about a good-hearted man working for an intelligence agency whose friends are gunned down by a clandestine group operating within the government.
Maybe there's another CIA. Inside the CIA.
The new Hydra grew, a beautiful parasite inside S.H.I.E.L.D.
The hero goes on the run and gets the help of a stranger. In fact, the Faye Dunaway character's role was split between the Black Widow and Sam Wilson in The Winter Soldier. Now, this accomplice helps the hero kidnap a government operative. The hero is also being pursued by a ruthless assassin. There's a tense elevator scene, there's some gritty hand-to-hand combat, and a scene where they play a stereo loud to drown out any potential microphones listening into their conversation. Cliff Robertson, who plays Uncle Ben by the way, also plays a boss who reports to a council, and there are even matching shots of him and Alexander Pierce looking out of skyscraper windows. Now, the scene where the Winter Soldier is waiting on Pierce is also lifted from Redford confronting the final villain in 3 days. And both movies end with the heroes going public with government secrets.
Hydra was selling you lies, not intelligence.
What did you do?
I told him a story.
But, according to the reign of Marvel Studios, Marcus and McFeely struggled with this ending because, unlike a paranoid conspiracy thriller, a superhero movie needs to end on an upbeat note. And then, in the summer of 2011, they had the idea and they came to Kevin Feige and said, "I think we're ready to take down S.H.I.E.L.D." So, let's dive into this movie. Now, originally, the screenplay's opening scene was going to be set in World War II, with Cap and the Howling Commandos being pinned down in a trench, and Steve leading the charge against a big Hydra gun. This would have reminded the audience of Steve's relationship with Bucky and would have ended with Steve waking up from a dream, just like these Bucky flashbacks in the original Winter Soldier comics. This also plays into Cap's Rip Van Winkle aesthetic that I'm going to talk about later in the video. So this sequence was storyboarded and ultimately cut because that Smithsonian sequence serves the same purpose. Kevin Feige said, "We realized the best thing for the movie would be just to throw the audience into the modern world with Cap." Now, as we watch this movie together, keep in mind the duality of its core: freedom versus fear, S.H.I.E.L.D. versus Hydra, Captain America versus the Winter Soldier. This duality is going to appear again and again in the film. It's even present in the opening shot, at dawn, where we see the world as half dark and half light. Now, this is the Potomac River, which is also the setting for the climax of the film. And we also see the duality of government literally reflected in the water. The Washington Monument's reflection mirrors the surface, just like Hydra mirrors S.H.I.E.L.D. So these opening shots look simple, but they were actually really difficult to pull off. The National Park Service didn't want to allow the production to film around the pool. So locations manager James Lynn actually shot a mock-up sequence where he ran around the pool with a tripod to show the service how non-invasive they would be. And as you can see here, these shots were obtained by a Steadicam that was mounted on a glorified tricycle. So to make it seem like Steve is superhuman, Anthony Mackie had to jog along at a trot while Evans always sprinted. And this opening also established a key aspect of the film's visual language. Notice the little Steadicam shake. Almost every single shot in this movie is handheld, and here it gives the appearance of someone hidden, someone spying on them, just like the opening of Coppola's film, The Conversation. The handheld look is akin to a documentary style called cinema verite, better known as fly-on-the-wall cinema, where documentary subjects are presented with very little editing. In this film, it makes us always feel like these events are grounded and happening in the real world, while also making us feel a little uneasy.
This movie's all handheld. It's just a really interesting approach to a superhero movie. I don't think I've seen a superhero movie shot that way yet.
And this opening is one of 2 places in the movie where we hear Alan Silvestri's original theme from Captain America: First Avenger.
I need a new set of lungs, dude.
Now, this is because, at this point, Steve Rogers actually feels like his old self. His story is a retelling of Rip Van Winkle, the Irving Washington story about a man who slept through the American Revolution and then had to adapt to living in a different country. Steve's challenge in this movie is that he doesn't know his country any longer. And by extension, that means that Captain America doesn't know who he is or how he fits into this new world. And then we meet Sam Wilson, the future Falcon. Now, co-producer Nate Moore is largely the reason Falcon is in this movie. He was his favorite character when he was a kid. When he pitched the hero to Marcus and McFeely, they replied, "Why would we do the Falcon? He looks ridiculous." And frankly, they had a point. His 1970s outfit with the shirt open to the belly button has not aged well. And then Marcus and McFeely asked, "Do people like the Falcon?" And Moore's reply gave us Sam Wilson in the MCU. He said, "People love the Falcon." So in the comics, Sam grew up in Harlem, and he was a social worker who just had an affinity for birds. But a run-in with the Red Skull and the Cosmic Cube gave him the ability to communicate with his Falcon, named Red Wing, and after 4.5 years in the comics, he finally got vibranium wings from Wakanda that allowed him to fly. Now, he was so popular back in the 70s that the book was renamed Captain America and the Falcon for 7 years. And technically, he is Marvel's first African-American superhero because the Black Panther is African. He was also one of the rare heroes back then who didn't have black in his name.
Hey, it's Black Falcon!
Just Falcon, kid.
Now, when Anthony Mackie heard that he got the role, he broke down in tears because he knew that some little brown boy was going to come to his door at Halloween dressed as the Falcon. And he brought that joy onto set with him, as you can see in the BTS.
Cut the check, cut the check, cut the check, cut the check.
And of course, Steve introduces himself by saying,
On your left.
which not only comes back later in the movie,
On your left.
and also in Avengers Endgame,
On your left.
but notice that when Sam does meet with old Steve, he approaches on his left, which is a great observation by the channel New Rock Stars. So when they finally meet, Sam forms an immediate connection with Steve because he sees him as a soldier and not a celebrity.
It's your bed, right? Your bed is too soft. When I was over there, I sleep on the ground, use rock for pillows like a caveman.
And that idea is called back when we see Bucky still sleeping on the floor in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And Steve sees that Sam served because of his Air National Guard sweatshirt. Now Sam makes it clear that he knows Steve is famous, but he mostly cares about him as a person and a veteran.
Anytime you want to stop by the VA, make me look awesome in front of the girl at the front desk, just let me know.
Now, after being thought out, Steve is probably used to people always wanting something from him, but Sam is just somebody who wants to give and not take. And then we get to the famous notebook where Steve is writing down everything that he missed. And also, Bucky uses this notebook for his apology tour in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now, the filmmakers famously swapped out different names for different countries.
We thought it was important to see Cap's notebook because it's a good way to deal with the idea that Steve Rogers is a man out of time.
And these alternates were actually chosen by internet polling.
It essentially amounted to an internet campaign where we asked people to weigh in on the different things they thought Steve would have in his notebook.
And this was the last wholesome thing to ever come out of the internet. In the UK, it lists the 1966 World Cup, the Beatles, Sherlock, and Sean Connery. In France, The Fifth Element by French director Luc Besson, Daft Punk, and the 1998 World Cup. Korea offers up Dance Dance Revolution. Italy has Roberto Benigni and his masterpiece Life is Beautiful. Australia and New Zealand voted in Steve Irwin and the amazing cookie Tim Tams. Brazil has Zsa Zsa. Russia voted for Disco and the communist Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Spain has tennis legend Rafael Nadal and the candy Chupa Chups. And Latin America has Shakira and heck yes, I love Shakira. Darn right you do. Germany listed Oktoberfest and Currywurst. And in the USA, Steve missed out on I Love Lucy, The Fall of the Berlin Wall, Steve Jobs, and Disco. Oh yeah, Disco, like on Russia's list. Right, so the one person that could have ended the Cold War early was Disco Stu.
Disco Stew doesn't advertise.
But this short exchange between Sam and Steve is actually crucial for the rest of the movie. The last time we saw Steve Rogers, he was still very much a man out of time.
He's not that thing, though. Guy's like a Stephen Hawking.
What's your thing, Pilates? What?
No one to his personal flying monkeys.
Monkeys. I do not understand.
I do. I understood that reference.
And the MCU is largely based on the Ultimate Comics, which is a more grounded relaunch of the Marvel characters. Ultimate Captain America is very old-fashioned. When his enemy tells him to surrender, he screams, "Do you think this A stands for France?" And when he dates Janet Van Dyne, she gets bored with him because he just wants to hang out with people who are in their 80s and go to dance halls to dance to 1940s music. We could have easily seen a movie with a more regressive Captain America, but instead, this scene establishes that Steve Rogers is catching up to the modern day.
Things aren't so bad. Food's a lot better. We used to boil everything. No polio's good. Internet, so helpful.
And this also establishes that Steve is always the optimist who sees the good in the world and in people. But Sam's #1 recommendation is
Marvin Gaye, 1972 Trouble Man soundtrack.
an album which you'll remember Zemo also extolled the virtues of.
It is a masterpiece, James. Complete, comprehensive, captures the African-American experience.
He's out of line, but he's right. It's great.
But they did not choose this album randomly. The movie is about a private detective named T who goes on the run from a crime boss and the police after he's framed for murder. Very similar to what Steve goes through in this movie. And Zemo is right. This soundtrack is a banger. Yeah, we should do a video. Zemo was right, but like about Trouble Man. That's a great idea. High five. And then Steve gets a text from Natasha, and notice how Shield phones even have their logo branding on the wallpaper.
Does announcing your identity on clothing help with the covert part of your job?
Notice how she tells him to meet at the curb, showing that she knows where he is, hinting at the surveillance state plot that's to come. And then she includes a smiley face.
Either one of you know where the Smithsonian is? I'm here to pick up a fossil.
Natasha teases Steve like this all through the movie to keep him from taking himself too seriously. So this is to help him acclimate to the 21st century, and it works. Later, he even makes his own joke.
You do anything fun Saturday night?
Well, all the guys from my barbershop quartet are dead, so no, not really.
It's like Fury assigned her to Steve for this reason, to make sure he didn't think too hard about all the people he had lost. Her license plate reads 1IR31I, and this might be a reference to the Soviet-era ham radio R311, also known as Omega, as a callback to Natasha being Russian. And now, let's get to the boat sequence. Now, there is a lot to break down here. First of all, there's actually a mistake here. In the longitude and latitude numbers, two of them are listed for the north, but the second number should be 72E, which would place them just off the coast of India, which makes sense because later, the Indian representative of the World Security Council says,
"Well, considering this attack took place 1 mile from my country's sovereign waters, it's a bit more than that."
The name of the ship is the Lemurian Star, a reference to Marvel's undersea kingdom of Lemuria, which is a rival to Atlantis in the comics. Now, they actually did film this on a real boat, the Sea Launch Commander, and just like in the movie, the ship launches satellites. In fact, this ship is largely responsible for the plot of the movie. When they were scouting a different ship, the filmmakers learned that it was large enough to launch satellites, and then this gave them the idea of government surveillance and drone strikes being the center of the movie. You gotta remember, this movie was written just after Edward Snowden leaked NSA documents that revealed that government surveillance programs were watching us from space. We meet Frank Grillo as Brock Rumlow, who in the comics is the supervillain Crossbones. He's a mercenary who is more of a physical threat to Captain America, and I love how, in this movie, they reinvented him as a foot soldier for Hydra. He even has a grudging respect for Captain America all through the movie. Like, they may be on different sides of the war, but he recognizes that at least they're both soldiers. Their mission is to stop the pirates who took over the ship. But later in the movie, it's revealed that Fury actually hired the pirates to give Black Widow an excuse to download Project Insight from the ship's computer. Even this early in the movie, Fury was already suspicious of Project Insight. When Rumlow runs through the hostages, we see Jasper Sitwell. Now, in the comics, Sitwell is kind of a nerdy SHIELD agent, more of a numbers guy. He first appeared in the MCU in the short called The Consultant, where Agent Coulson explained why they sent Tony Stark to pick a fight with Thunderbolt Ross at the end of The Incredible Hulk.
I hear you have an unusual problem. You should talk. You should listen.
He later appeared in the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and frankly, it was a genuine shock when he turned out to be Hydra. The screen also says he is Honduran American, just like the actor Maximiliano Hernandez. And then we see Batroc the Leaper, who is like a Z-list Captain America villain from the comics. Now, he's a good fighter, but he's mostly known for speaking with an over-the-top French accent. Ha! Now it is Batroc's turn.
I'm French! Why do you think I have this outrageous accent, you silly king?
But for the movie, the character definitely isn't a joke. He is played by UFC champion Georges St. Pierre.
We tried to put together a fight that played to Georges St. Pierre's strengths. It's an honor getting beat up by Captain America.
Now, according to the book, The Reign of Marvel Studios, the Russos constructed every action sequence with a portfolio of visual references. And to show the frenetic pace of the boat fight, they use clips from The Bourne Identity and MMA fights, particularly how fast MMA fighters punched. And this is how they discovered St. Pierre and cast him in this role. And remember, he later returns in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. They went through several designs for his costume, but landed on one that included comic-accurate colors, but they were able to still keep the grounded tone of the movie. The sequence is also when we were introduced to Steve's new uniform based on the design from the comics when he was director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Notice that now you can see his ears, just like in the comics, and it actually took them a while to get the design just right without looking silly. Now, his suit is designed for stealth, and the muted colors also play into the color palette of the movie. As you can see in this image created by Movie Palette, the movie has a very dark color tone until a key moment at the end that we're going to talk about later. Now, at the beginning, both his uniform and shield are more gray to reflect how he now lives in a morally gray world. Notice Steve and Natasha both have shield logos on their arm, but in Age of Ultron, Steve replaces his with an Avengers logo. And this carries on his main character's motivation from Captain America the First Avenger. He wants to join a team and belong. And notice that his new suit does still have the stripes on his abs, they're just much darker colors. And then we see that they are in a Quinjet, the plane that the Avengers used in the comics that we saw S.H.I.E.L.D. use in the Avengers film. And then we see the plane go into a quiet hover mode, but it does not have the stealth capability that Tony Stark added to the Avengers Quinjet in Age of Ultron.
We can't track you in stealth mode.
Steve continues the Marvel hero tradition of a superhero jumping out of the back of a plane.
Is he wearing a parachute? No.
Seriously, they do that a lot, but the reason he goes in without a parachute is so he doesn't get spotted and he can hit the water at maximum speed. The opening boat sequence is also key for catching us on how Captain America fights and how he's changed since coming out of the ice. Now, his fighting in the Avengers was pretty basic, but in this movie, we get to see how he has evolved.
We wanted to come out of the gates full force because we knew we were bringing a fresh version of Cap to people in this movie because of the fact he's evolved since audiences have seen him last.
But the sequence is also setting the tone for the grounded action we see in the rest of the film.
We're telling the audiences in the 2 years since the Avengers, he's done all this training. So when you drop him on that boat, we're catching you up to speed on how he fights now, that it's real world.
The Russos' guiding principle was, what would a superhero actually do to people in the real world?
He's gonna, you know, what we call knockout shots, right? Every guy, when he leaves that guy's gotta be out, because if that guy gets up and pulls an alarm, everything's over. So you'll notice that, you know, every guy he approaches is either thrown overboard or completely knocked out before he moves on to the next guy.
So the wire work in this fight is just used to augment a normal human's ability to jump, to show that Steve is just a little bit above everyone else. Also notice that when Steve jumps, you can hear the vibranium shield moving with each leap. Now, they did film on a real ship that was docked, and then they kept all the cameras on one side so they were always filming out to sea. And I want to point out some cool moments here in this fight. Steve speeds through the ship, kicks a guy overboard, and then takes a knife off this guy and throws it at this guard's hand before he can ring the alarm. And then when he throws the shield, he beats this guy up and then perfectly times his catch. But we also see him use his shield in more inventive ways, like when he puts the shield in front of this guy and then punches him through the shield. Also notice how the camera moves with every punch. It's not the same like fast-cutting style as the Bourne movies, but the camera does work with the action to enhance each punch and give it a fast-cut feel. This is actually the way they film professional wrestling. After Natasha lands, she suggests,
What about the nurse that lives across the hall from you? She seems kind of nice.
Making me think that she definitely knew that Sharon was a SHIELD plant. The sequence was also inspired by James Bond movies, like when we see Steve fire a high-tech listening device on the glass to overhear Batroc reveal where the hostages are.
Appel Durand. Je veux qu'on s'arrache dès que la rançon arrive.
Oui, Batroc.
Okay.
Which sets up Natasha for her fight, where she wraps her grappling hook around this guy's neck and then uses him as a counterweight to drop into the bows of the ship. And this actually was Scarlett Johansson being dropped 3 stories by the stunt team.
We had her up about 3 stories inside of a ship with steel all around, and we dropped her down. It was about a 30 or 40 foot drop.
Little detail here, she's blinded by this body when she shoots these guys, so she still checks afterwards to make sure they're dead. But I should note though that the kick and flip off of the rail is her stunt double, Heidi Moneymaker, who doubled for her from Iron Man 2 all the way through Black Widow. Natasha is able to beat these guys up who are bigger than her by using their own body weight against them, and many of those moves were developed by Moneymaker.
We have her style, and every time I come onto a new movie, I go with the flow, and then I start trying to put in really widowy, kind of flippy, twisty, lucha libre type fun moves so that she still has that flair to it.
And the design team redesigned Natasha's bracelets for the movie and added a choker wire, which we see her use in MCU films after this point. And while this is happening, the rest of the team is rappelling down the side of the ship to burst inside. And this is all while Steve is listening in on Batroc. And this is an important story beat. They didn't want Steve to just run into the ship and beat everybody up. The movie has to establish that Black Widow is also a formidable fighter, but they also want to show the future Hydra agents in action so they will be a credible threat to Steve later in the movie. One of my favorite moments of the fight is right after the hostages are rescued. The focus is on Batroc, and then Steve emerges out of focus in the background to throw his shield. And when you slow it down, you can see that Batroc barely notices in time and he ducks. I actually prefer this to how it was storyboarded, with the shot of Steve leaping toward the window and throwing his shield. The edit is much faster, more unexpected, and propels us into the Batroc fight. The fight kicks off with Batroc's signature leaping kick, and because he catches Captain America off guard, we now understand this guy is a credible boss fight. Now, what is really impressive though is that Chris Evans did about 95% of the stunt work in this fight, except for that windmill kick here at the end. The choreography of the fight was designed around Georges St. Pierre to showcase his skills as an MMA fighter. Steve is able to fend off Batroc's moves mostly by using his shield, and then he goads him in French. Actually, what he says is, "I thought you were more than just a shield." And Steve understands him because he also speaks French from his time in World War II, and he says,
"Challenge accepted." No.
But this also speaks to Steve's arc in the movie. He begins the film serving his country, and he identifies himself as a servant of the state, and the shield is a symbol of his country. So Steve's arc in this movie is to realize that he is more than a shield and to embrace his own humanity. Even without the shield, he takes down Batroc easily, and they tumble into the server room where Widow is retrieving Project Insight for Fury.
Oh, this is awkward.
Now, this movie plays with this dynamic for the first half of the film. We're really not sure if we can trust Natasha or not. She is Russian, she could be a double agent, and this sets up her greater arc that we're going to talk about later in the video. And then this hood throws a grenade, so Steve grabs Natasha because he knows he can get them out of the room faster than she could by herself, and shout out to Canadian Lad for noticing this cool detail. She shoots the window to weaken the glass first so they're able to burst through it more easily. And then we go to Washington, D.C. to a new building, the Triskelion. Now, this building first appeared in the Ultimates comics, where it was the headquarters for S.H.I.E.L.D. and that universe's Avengers. It actually breaks a rule in Washington, D.C. that no building can be taller than the Washington Monument, and they designed the building to be large and sprawling, basically overtaking Theodore Roosevelt Island. And this is a metaphor for Project Insight sprawling and overtaking people's personal liberties. Concept artist James Carson designed the Triskelion to mimic the brutalist architecture that dominated Eastern Europe during the Cold War, further hinting that S.H.I.E.L.D. was actually run by an organization that wanted to create a totalitarian state. Now, the lobby of S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters is similar to the lobby of the S.H.I.E.L.D. Academy that we saw in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episode Seeds. And when Quake was looking at a wall of fallen S.H.I.E.L.D. heroes, she even mentions
Bucky Barnes.
And it's also similar to the headquarters for S.W.O.R.D. that we saw in WandaVision. That agency basically replaced S.H.I.E.L.D., and both organizations feature a statue of their logo in the lobby. After Steve confronts him, Fury says,
"Last time I trusted someone, I lost an eye."
Which we know from the movie Captain Marvel is not true. His eye was scratched out by a space cat. But even then, in that movie, we see Fury building the legend of his lost eye. And, as we see, this was for a good reason. He had a backup ocular lock keyed to his damaged eye in case he was ever locked out of the system. And then we go to this elevator conversation, which continues the movie's recurrence of elevators using to hide secrets. This is a brilliant dialogue scene that uses a story to lay out the movie's theme, freedom versus fear. Steve begins by saying,
"You know, they used to play music."
So already, Steve is remarking how, in the past, the world was more pleasant, and this prompts Fury to tell his story.
My grandfather operated one of these things for 40 years. Worked in a nice building, got good tips. Time went on, neighborhood got rougher. They said, keep on stepping.
And by the way, Samuel L. Jackson's granddad actually was an elevator operator. The world of the MCU of this movie is meant to mirror our own. I mean, we live in a national security state where people have sacrificed certain freedoms in order to feel more safe. But the Russos say in the audio commentary that Steve is removed from all of that because he didn't live through the Cold War and 9/11. Now, when Nick Fury begins his story about his granddad, it starts in that nice world that Steve remembers. His granddad is able to walk home with his tip money and feel safe. But then the neighborhood gets rough, just like the world grew more dangerous in Steve's absence. And then Fury talks about how his granddad kept a gun in his lunch bag, and notice the background.
Each on. Bunch of crumpled ones and a loaded .22 Magnum.
As soon as he mentions the gun, this is the moment when they descend into the underground hangar to see Project Insight's gunship helicarriers. The symbolism here is that the carriers are the gun hidden at the bottom of the lunch bag, but also the deeper you dig, the more you find buried secrets. The Insight carriers are designed to eliminate threats before they happen, and Anthony Russo said that we were all reading the articles that were coming out about questioning drone strikes, preemptive strikes, and civil liberties. We wanted to put all of that into the film because it would be a contrast to Captain America's Greatest Generation way of thinking. Fury says the carriers fly with repulsor technology designed by Stark.
He had a few suggestions once he got an up-close look at our old turbines.
And the close look he's referring to was this scene in the Avengers when he and Steve restarted the propellers together.
It seems to run on some form of electricity.
The repulsor technology allows the carriers to run continuously in the air. And this is actually an old school Cold War nuclear deterrent. We actually still have nuclear bombs in the air at all times to this day. Now, the satellites that guide the carriers are an invasion of privacy that is meant to symbolize the civil liberties compromised by the Patriot Act.
The satellites can read a terrorist's DNA before he steps outside his spider hole.
But Steve sees this quantum surge and recognizes it as just one more bully on the block.
By holding a gun to everyone on Earth and calling it protection. This isn't freedom. This is fear.
And remember, bullies are the reason that Steve signed up for war to begin with.
I don't like bullies.
Fury calls Steve out for his hypocrisy.
You know, I read those SSR files. Greatest Generation? You guys did some nasty stuff.
Mentioning the old SSR files is also foreshadowing the SSR headquarters that we see later in the movie. But also, in the original Winter Soldier comic book run, Steve reveals that Bucky was always the guy that they would send behind enemy lines to do nasty work. And we see a hint of this in the first Avenger montage when Bucky snipes people. But you get the feeling that that montage really did cut out a lot of the nastier stuff that Bucky had to do in order to win the war. So after Steve sees how the world is changing, he immediately retreats into familiar things, riding his motorcycle and going to the Smithsonian to visit what's left of his old friends. Now, they actually did film this intro in the Pioneers of Flight Gallery in the Aerospace Smithsonian Museum, and they were terrified that the camera on the crane would damage one of these planes. For instance, this is the Spirit of St. Louis that Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic Ocean, and this plane was part of the USA's first mission to fly around the globe. The red one on the very back is a Lockheed Vega, the plane that Amelia Earhart tried to fly around the world, and this one is a Fokker T-2, the first plane to fly across the continental United States. This is the Wright brothers' first plane, which they built in Ohio. It is just behind a replica of NASA's Pioneer 10, the first craft to go past Jupiter. The camera goes past NASA's X-15, which was the first plane to hit Mach 5, before finally descending to another relic, Captain America. This quote on the wall is from President Matthew Ellis, who was president in Iron Man 3 and also in the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. The film playing here is there to remind the audience about Steve's past in World War II, but also to show us that he is now regarded as a kind of living legend. And it's narrated by Lieutenant Dan himself, Gary Sinise.
A symbol to the nation.
Now, the before photo of Steve is the same one that Peggy has at the end of First Avenger, and that we see it later framed on her desk in Avengers Endgame. And the after picture is actually a BTS photo taken from this exact moment in First Avenger. The kids comparing themselves to Steve's height is a callback to the recruitment station in the first movie, where Steve wasn't able to measure up to the ideal height of a soldier. And now, this scene is showing us how Captain America has grown into more of an idea than a person. And Steve is wondering if he can actually live up to this ideal in this new jaded world. Now, the kid they're holding is also wearing a Captain America costume based off the design that we saw him wear in the Avengers. The kid that sees Steve is actually one of the Russo brothers' nephew, Basil, and he was not fooled by the classic MCU disguise of a baseball cap.
It's not a disguise, Hank. We look like ourselves at a baseball game.
And notice this other kid in the background giving the Cap mural a quick salute. They actually filmed this scene in a real museum, and in the concept art of the movie you can see they actually designed a shield fixture for the ceiling, but you can't really see it in any of the footage. In the background here we see that he saved over 160 lives in a Zonzo, and that was his first mission in First Avenger. And this is a replica of his World War II bike with the Howard Stark modifications. Remember, the original bike exploded on his final mission. Now, this sequence serves two functions. It tells the audience information about Cap, but it also shows us that Steve no longer knows who he is. He's watching his own life play out in front of him. And this shows how his story has continued on without him there. In a way, at this point, he's like Thor in the first Thor.
The first time in my life, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do.
Now, the Bucky display is there to remind us of his best friend, but it also has a mistake. The text here reads that he was born in 1916, but the years below say he was born in 1917. So take that, Russo brothers! Your stupid movie isn't so perfect after all. And the shot where Steve looks through the glass pane is a visual way to show us that Bucky is not only gone, but all that remains is a transparent, ghostly image of his friend. Remember that image for later on. The sequence also relives the events of the movie First Avenger, but now they feel hollow. For instance, he watches a film of himself, just like he did in Captain America First Avenger. But in that movie, the newsreel was optimistic and hopeful, but now he is revisiting a dead past. Notice how even the mannequins of the Howling Commandos don't have faces. They're more like ghosts than they are people. Now, in the film, Peggy mentions that
he saved over 1,000 men, including the man who would become my husband.
Alright, when Steve returned at the end of Avengers Endgame, writers Marcus and McFeely said that they imagined Steve had lived through the events of the MCU, while the Russo brothers claimed that Steve lived in an alternate reality and then returned to his old reality to give Sam the shield. So, depending on who you believe, Peggy is either talking about Steve saving her husband or telling the truth
from a certain point of view.
Steve holds the compass with her image, a symbol to show that Peggy is always his true north, and as he tells her later, he actually joined S.H.I.E.L.D. because she helped to found it. Now, the compass first appeared in newsreel footage in the last film. It was left on the deck of the Valkyrie when Steve crashed, and we see Steve looking at it again in Avengers Endgame to foreshadow that he will eventually choose to be with her by the end of the film. But in this film, looking at the compass is the reason he decides to visit Peggy. Now, Peggy being alive was actually revealed in a deleted scene in The Avengers when Steve was working up the nerve to contact her, but then got distracted with an alien invasion. On her nightstand, we see photos of Peggy with a young girl, probably Sharon Carter, her niece. Now, they didn't apply much makeup to Haley Atwell to make her look older. Instead, they employed a similar technique to how they made Chris Evans look skinny in the first Avenger. They used digital effects. Atwell and an older actor performed the scene, and then they shrunk Atwell's face digitally and combined the two.
It's been so long. So long.
And there's also some subtle set dressing here. Notice the pill bottles by her bedside and the English tea set behind Steve. Peggy is filled with images of her dying present, while Steve is framed by her vibrant past. And this also aligns with her dialogue.
You saved the world. We rather mucked it up. The world has changed. The best that we can do is to start over.
And these words are crucial because they inspire Steve to later take down S.H.I.E.L.D.
S.H.I.E.L.D., Hydra. It all goes.
But also, Steve later takes her advice and travels back in time to start over at the end of Endgame. And then, in a heartbreaking moment, we see the extent of her dementia.
Steve. Yeah. You're alive. You came back.
Now, this is a brutal reminder to Steve that he cannot return to the past. Just like a newsreel, returning to Peggy is just going to be the same story playing over and over. And then he reminds her,
well, I couldn't leave my best girl. Not when she owes me a dance.
Reminding us that they were supposed to have a dance at the end of First Avenger.
I had a date.
And this also sets us up for their final ending in Avengers Endgame. Back at Fury's office, he plugs in the Lemurian star data that Natasha stole, and then he's shut out of the system. So for the first time in the MCU, we see Nick Fury not in total control of a situation. Then he has to take an elevator up to the top floor, symbolically showing us that there is someone even higher than him at this organization, Alexander Pierce, played by screen legend Robert Redford. Now, Redford agreed to be in the movie because he wanted to be in a film that his grandkids would see, and his casting was a brilliant choice. For one, his film 3 Days of the Condor was the entire basis for this movie's plot. But also, Redford's mostly spent his storied career playing heroes, so his turn as a Hydra asset is genuinely shocking. The Russo brothers compared his casting to Henry Fonda playing a brutal murderer in Once Upon a Time in the West. It's an American hero turned into a villain. Now, he is at a meeting of the World Security Council, the same group that Fury reported to in the first Avengers movie. Now, back then, they were still mysterious silhouettes, like the Council of 13 and the Venture Brothers.
The Council of 13, not magic angel babies.
We don't have like a magic window into the past.
Okay, I get it. But now the technology has advanced, and they are holograms projected onto screens. Now we see this technology advance even further in Avengers Infinity War, when Ross and the rest of this council are just projected as images inside of a room. Only one member has returned from the Avengers, it's Pamela Hawley, but the most famous member of the original lineup was Gideon Malik, played by Powers Booth. In the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., it was revealed that he too was a Hydra agent. And there's a couple of hints in this meeting that Pierce is secretly Hydra. When they ask about the hijacking, he says,
I don't care about one boat, I care about the fleet.
Now this shows that he does not mind sacrificing individuals if it saves the entire world, just like the Project Insight carriers are planning to do. And this line,
maybe we need someone to oversee us,
is basically saying that he's ready to hand the world over to Zola's algorithm and Hydra. After Fury raises his concerns, he name drops Iron Man, asking for a favor.
But you gotta get Iron Man to stop by my niece's birthday party.
Thank you, sir.
Not just a flyby. He's got to mingle.
I wonder if Tony was doing this kind of favor when Peter Parker tried to reach him in Spider-Man Homecoming. Notice how Pierce's office, like Fury's, is painted in these very dull, gray, brutalist colors. This matches the color palette of the movie, even Cap's uniform, to show that we are now living in a morally gray world. And then, this takes us to the warm environment of the VA, which is made of natural colors like yellow and orange lighting and brown wood paneling. The woman who talks about swerving from a plastic bag is Angela Russo Atsat, the sister of the Russo brothers. So we transition from two meetings. The World Security Council is concerned with big picture problems like wars, while this scene is showing us the real human consequences of those wars. And here we see what will become Sam's greatest superpower throughout his history in the MCU, his ability to empathize with others.
Some stuff you leave there, other stuff you bring back. It's our job to figure out how to carry it.
And in Avengers Endgame, Steve leads a similar group, perhaps trying to carry on this kind of work after Sam was snapped away. He opens up to Steve about losing a friend in the war, which immediately endears them to each other. They're both old soldiers who have lost people. And then Steve talks about how he doesn't actually know what makes him happy.
What makes you happy?
I don't know.
And this line is picked up again in his next movie, Age of Ultron, when the villain says,
God's righteous man, pretending you could live without a war.
And then we go to one of the greatest action sequences in the MCU, Fury's car chase. It begins with Fury getting eyed by these 3 Hydra cops. And notice how the bad guys in this sequence are all either wearing SWAT helmets or sunglasses to hide their faces. This makes them appear more inhuman, like the MiG pilots in Top Gun or the agents in the Matrix movies. Notice his windshield is also a heads-up display, which is a technology that does finally exist today in luxury cars with a smart windshield. Then the cops pin him in, breaking his wrist immediately, which is why Fury injects himself with a local anesthetic. This is also why later in the movie he still has his arm in a sling. Now, the Russos said that they based this sequence on the bank heist in Michael Mann's Heat.
Experientially, this is still the most intense 8 minutes of filmmaking I've seen in 20 years in a movie theater. How do we beat it?
In that sequence, bank robbers are pinned down in a car, followed by a slow build-up when they're surrounded by police until a gunfight breaks out with automatic weapons. Both scenes are filmed handheld to place the viewer in the middle of the action. The Russos and Michael Mann also mounted cameras to cars, usually low to the ground to give the illusion of speed. And by the way, those shots are some of the few non-handheld shots in the entire movie. And in both movies, the police fire indiscriminately into crowds of civilians with their machine guns. Also, notice how the first bullet holes that hit the car windshield are from a POV shot, making us feel like we are the ones being shot at. And later, I especially love this POV shot where Fury runs from a guy, but we see it happen from inside of the car behind him. See, little details like this are what make this chase feel like it has stakes that involve real, actual people. In fact, they really did film this chase in downtown Cleveland, the Russo brothers' hometown, even mapping out parts of the chase by using Hot Wheels and chalk drawing. And the Penske truck that hits the Hydra agents at the end is the same truck that takes out Sitwell later in the movie. The Russo brothers even joked that this could be the Punisher, a lone wolf out there with his own vendetta. Now, they also based the beginning of this chase on a real car chase from Sao Paulo, Brazil in 2010, where a vehicle got stuck in traffic and just started bashing into the other cars. Fury's car is self-driving, just like Tony Stark's car in Age of Ultron. And notice the car says,
Vertical takeoff.
Flight systems damaged.
Meaning that Fury has a flying car, just like Howard Stark tried to build in the first Avenger, and like Phil Coulson's car Lola in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Fury is also famous for driving flying cars in the comics. Now, when the Hydra agents bring in the battering ram, that's really Sam Jackson in the car getting knocked around. But the chase features a mix of practical and digital effects, like filming Sam Jackson on a green screen for the close-ups where he's leaning out of his window in this shot. Now, Fury lets them use the battering ram on the glass to weaken its integrity so he can shoot through it. In other words, he is using Hydra's weapons against them, just like how Hydra has secretly been using the weapons of S.H.I.E.L.D. to take control. And the console machine gun they built was an actual practical effect built from real steel and not rubber, and it cost $65,000.
A small price to pay for salvation.
And then we get the first on-screen appearance of the Winter Soldier. Now, I love how we first see him out of focus through bullet holes. It visually mirrors the pane of glass with Bucky's story from the museum, but now the glass is cracked and opaque because of all the gunfights and violence. Similar to how Bucky can no longer remember his past because of all of the years of violence and brainwashing. And then the camera slowly rack focuses to reveal the Winter Soldier, like he's a ghost who has just come from the shadows. He flips Fury's vehicle with the same detonator he used in the Thunderbolts, and of course he has this iconic theme. And that theme is actually a Scream that was remixed. Now, on IMDb trivia, there's a false rumor that they took Bucky's Scream from First Avenger and remixed it. But actually, on comicbook.com, composer Henry Jackman gave an interview where he confirmed that this was actually his voice. He said, "The Winter Soldier starts off unrelenting and brutal and mechanized and almost Terminator-like. But the difference between the Winter Soldier and the Terminator is that somewhere behind the wires and the mechanization is a character who we know and we care about." So one of the things I ended up doing with the Winter Soldier was I spent literally 10 days just on production with vocals because I wanted to get the sensation of a human trapped inside machinery. So I did a lot of vocal recordings and then processed the living hell out of them to get these tortured, time-stretched human cries of someone who has been so processed that it's become mechanized. But at the same time, you can still hear the human in there. So there you go. If somebody says that that's actually Bucky's Scream, then they're wrong and they just get all their shit from IMDb. Now, they went through several designs for the Winter Soldier, starting with the original design by Steve Epting from the comics. Epting drew him with a domino mask, just like like the one that Bucky originally wore. The art department experimented with the mask, but they settled on dark makeup around the eyes to mimic the look, but not actually show Bucky looking like a character from the 40s. So he is designed to be the visual opposite of Captain America, so his colors contrast with Steve's, and his mask covers the opposite parts of his face. They also wanted the technology of his arm to just seem slightly ahead of what Tony Stark could do at this time. And they also made 3 versions of the arm. One was digital for action scenes, then there was a foam version for scenes where Sebastian Stan had to act, and they also made a urethane version that was metallized just to look cool. And this laser cutter that Nick Fury escapes with has the same blue beam as this one, used to cut into the Valkyrie in First Avenger. And in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episode that aired right after this movie was released, it was revealed that Fitz actually invented that laser cutter.
It's called a mouse hole. Cuts through anything, really. I designed it a year ago and submitted it for testing, but it never reached distribution.
And then we go to Steve arriving home and meeting Sharon Carter, played by Emily Van Camp. Now, Sharon was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and first appeared in Tales of Suspense number 75, where, just like in the movie, Steve encounters her while he's in civilian clothes and he doesn't know that she is a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. In fact, she reminds him of Peggy, who wouldn't have her first appearance until 2 issues later. Also, in that issue, Steve fights Batroc the Leaper, just like in this movie. In the audio commentary, Joe Russo said that even though there's obvious chemistry between them, Steve still has a hard time asking her out because underneath all that muscle, he's still just that awkward 90-pound guy. And I love how, like, just awkward and hopeful he is after he asks her out.
Cup of coffee?
And after he says,
I'll keep my distance.
She replies,
Hopefully not too far.
Which sounds flirty, but it's really a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent not wanting her target to get out of her sight. The Russos said that the reason Steve doesn't live in the Triskelion is because he wants to feel grounded. And we even saw this in Age of Ultron when he didn't really like living in Avengers Tower.
I don't think I can afford a place in Brooklyn.
Now, on his shelf, we see a variety of historical books to make Steve Rogers appeal to a wide political spectrum. There's Madam President, about the possibility of a woman president, biographies of George W. Bush and Barack Obama, volumes of history about World War II, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and The Night Stalkers, which is about the Air Force's covert airborne special ops. But he also has Hemingway's memoir, A Movable Feast, and The Catcher in the Rye, which oddly enough partially inspired Mark David Chapman to shoot John Lennon. So its inclusion in the movie might be a nod to the villain of the movie being an assassin. There's also Never Surrender, the life story of the general who was the commander of the Delta Force mission in Black Hawk Down, and my favorite book on the shelf is All the President's Men. This is the memoir of Woodward and Bernstein and how they exposed corruption in the Nixon administration. This event led to a distrust in federal institutions and spawned the conspiracy thriller genre of the 1970s. And of course, the film adaptation starred Alexander Pierce himself, Robert Redford. The message from the bookshelf is clear. Consider Steve Rogers America's dad. Now, in the concept art for Steve's apartment, you can also see posters for Harley Davidson, World War II Army recruitment posters, and posters that he hasn't bothered to hang up yet, showing how his life of Captain America is actually taking priority over his life as Steve Rogers. Outside, when Sharon told him,
Oh, and I think you left your stereo on.
He knew this wasn't the case because he had a vinyl record player that doesn't loop. The song playing is It's Been a Long, Long Time by Harry James and Kitty Callan. It was actually released in October 1945 after Steve went into the ice, but it's easy to see why Steve likes this song. Harry James was very popular in the 1940s, and the song is a romantic sweep about a couple being reunited, exactly what Steve longs for with Peggy. And it's actually been used several times in the MCU. Peggy and Steve, of course, dance to it at the end of Avengers Endgame, but it was also featured in Loki's Season 1 finale during the opening scrub to the Sacred Timeline.
Dance off, bro! He's a friend from work!
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know. I'll show you.
It's also in Season 2, Episode 5 of What If.
In a word, faster. Cars, computers, even the news moves fast.
And, the dancing?
And this is my favorite. The song inspired a level in the Star Wars Lego game where Wanda makes Steve hallucinate a dance with Peggy. So Steve sneaks in through a window closest to where he left his shield, just like we see here in the concept art. Fury says,
My wife kicked me out.
And as we found out in Secret Invasion, Fury does have a wife. She is a Skrull S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who was completely unable to detect that Hydra had infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. for decades. Then Fury is shot with wall-piercing rounds, and as he hands over the algorithm, he says,
Don't trust anyone.
Which is good timing because that's right when Sharon enters, a person who Steve thought was a civilian who then turns out to be a SHIELD agent. And this is a brilliant way to tell the audience that, hey, there is literally nobody in this movie that we can trust. And this makes us even doubt Natasha. Notice when she calls, she says,
Foxtrot is down.
But the reply says,
Do we have a 20 on the shooter?
But Sharon didn't even say that shots were fired, but the agents on the other end already knew because Fury had his apartment bugged. Steve once again chases down an assassin just like he did in First Avenger, and he is once again an unstoppable force, even running through this office building like the Hulk in the Avengers. Just like in First Avenger, nothing can slow Steve down until the Winter Soldier catches his shield. Now, from the concept art, we can see they originally were going to film this with Steve throwing the shield upwards, but I like that he throws it on the level because it implies that Steve and Bucky are on equal physical footing. Also, this assassination scene with the Winter Soldier targeting from a nearby roof is lifted from the very first panel of the Winter Soldier that we saw in Captain America Volume 5, Issue 6. Then we go to Natasha arriving at the hospital, and there is actually a deleted scene where a cop tries to stop her and she breaks his arm. Even when Maria Hill enters the frame, it's Natasha's reflection that stays in focus. Notice that as she and Steve look through the glass, Natasha is the person who stays in focus. In the audio commentary, the Russos said that they did this so they can make the scene all about her and focus on what she was feeling. Steve didn't trust Fury, but to Natasha, this is a mentor and a father figure. One of the doctors is played by director Joe Russo, who returned for cameos in other movies that I'm going to talk about in future videos. Natasha is staying with Fury's corpse until Hill says,
You need to take him.
Hinting that she was always in on this with Fury, helping him fake his own death. In the hallway, when Steve stares at the vending machine, notice how the sound drones out and then slips into diegetic sound, that is, sound within the scene. The Russos were actually inspired by this audio transition in The French Connection. Back at the Triskelion, Pierce shows Steve a video of Batroc's interrogation, which was carried out by writers Stephen McFeely and Christopher Marcus, making cameos in the film. He tells Steve that Fury paid Batroc to hijack the ship, which is true, but Fury did it so Natasha could steal the Project Insight data. Then he tells Steve that Fury inadvertently actually inspired him to join Hydra by showing him that he had to break rules to save lives.
It saved the lives of a dozen political officers, including my daughter.
Then he gives Steve a version of the advice that Peggy gave him.
And sometimes the best that we can do is to start over.
To build a really better world sometimes means having to tear the old one down.
Again, we're seeing the theme of duality occur in this movie. Steve and Bucky are opposites of each other, and SHIELD and Hydra are two sides of the same coin. And there are a couple of cool Easter eggs in the cinematography here. The shot of Redford looking out a window is an homage to Cliff Robertson's character in 3 Days of the Condor. And Redford is also filmed from Steve's hip, like they're gunslingers waiting to draw, because that's what this scene is. It's two men trying to size each other up. And then we go to one of the most famous fights in the MCU, the elevator. Notice how, before he boards, we can actually see the Watergate Hotel in the background, which is another nod to the 1970s conspiracy thrillers that this film is based on. Again, there's a metaphor here with an elevator going down as new secrets are revealed. Notice how, as they pass by each floor, it sounds like a heartbeat. Now, we begin in an empty elevator with transparent walls and a ceiling, so it's like we begin in a bright world, the bright, optimistic world that Steve came from. But as more people file in, the elevator becomes darker. It has the effect of making Steve feel claustrophobic, but also it's calling back to the darkened basements where secrets are revealed in other scenes from the movie. Now, after Steve clocks the soldier gripping his gun and a bead of sweat on this guy's face, he says,
Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?
I love that line so much, which is why we made it into a t-shirt with an RPG of Cap deciding to either say that line or hail Hydra. If you want to buy that shirt at our merch store, links are below. The elevator fight actually set the tone for the rest of the film.
We took 7 days to shoot that one scene in the elevator. And that was the first scene we shot in the film.
The Russos and stunt crew were meticulous with their planning.
What we did is we made a mock-up elevator, the same dimension of what we were going to use.
And action.
and they use that set to model out the entire fight.
So when we show up on the day, it's just a matter, we've already done it, let's just set up the cameras and shoot it.
Oh, I'm excited.
In the first draft, it was actually a chase through the Triskelion compound, but this scene has always ended the same way, with Steve falling and landing in the lobby. So this is actually a key scene in the entire MCU because, as the Russos say in the audio commentary, this is the moment when S.H.I.E.L.D. goes bad. 8 movies have built up to this, and we're just as shocked by the reveal as Steve is. So the tension is key in ratcheting up this betrayal. So this sequence begins with this inevitable feeling that Steve is in over his head and that things will end badly for him. The Russos use Brian De Palma's blowout as a model, where Jack has the best of intentions but ends up defeated and heartbroken by the end of the film. So Steve starts by dodging this baton, and then they detach the suitcase handle into a magnetic handcuff. When stuntman Guy De Silva was on the corridor crew, he said their direction at the start of the fight was,
"Now let's all act like we're really busy. Get busy, fall into each other."
Now the first thing they do after hitting stop is to take Steve's shield from him. At first, Steve struggles against everybody trying to pin him down, but as soon as he overcomes them, the music kicks in. So this is an important character moment for Steve. He now has clarity and he knows who his enemy is. The guy who was sweating earlier has the second handle cuff, which Steve kicks to the wall, maybe giving Rumlow the idea to then kick Steve's arm so the handle does pin his right arm against the wall. And this also shows how much of a threat Rumlow is. Steve has trouble fending him off when he has one arm metaphorically behind his back. And notice the shock baton works on Steve, just like how Yelena's Stinger slowed down another super soldier, John Walker, in the Thunderbolts. And I love this moment when Steve throws a guy in the air and then there's a literal smash cut to Sitwell monitoring the fight, which tells us that holy hell, everybody is in on this and nobody can be trusted.
The really cool thing about Chris Evans is that he's a super talented, athletic guy. He retains things amazingly well. I mean, I'm blown away.
Now on the corridor crew, Guy De Silva praised Chris Evans, saying,
"Chris Evans is dope because he'll come in and he has a dance background. He used to tap dance. So he understands rhythm and beats, and fight choreography is actually closer to dancing than it is to actual fighting martial arts."
So he grabs this guy's baton and uses it against the fighter, and then shows that he did not skip leg day, using a split kick and then prying the bracelet off the wall by using his full body weight. And then when he faces off with Rumlow, he says,
"I just want you to know, Cap, it's impersonal!"
further showing how Rumlow respects Steve as a fellow soldier.
Sorry, you caught an elbow. That could not have felt good.
Now when he throws him into the ceiling, this is a wire pull, and then we see this overhead shot where bodies and Steve's shield mysteriously appear, even though they weren't there a few seconds before. When Steve leaps from the elevator, it's also a metaphor for him completely rejecting the Hydra system of control and the spy game of secrets. And when he lands, he's able to survive because the vibranium shield absorbs the impact, but I love that it still hurts a little bit. And then we get the big set piece of the escape, Steve taking down a Quinjet. Now this imagery of a hero taking down a large non-human opponent is downright mythological. It's like Beowulf fighting the Grendel or a knight fighting a dragon. In this case, the Russos were inspired by another great 1970s film, The Car Chase and the French Connection. They compared Steve facing the Quinjet to Popeye Doyle's determination to chase that train down in that film. And the sequence plays out pretty much like it is in the animatic. Steve uses his shield to disable a rotor and then uses his bike to leap onto the top of the Quinjet so he can disable its rear engines. Then he hangs off the side and escapes when it crashes. But the animatic includes a soldier watching this happen who then lowers his gun when he sees that Steve just took down a frickin' Quinjet. Now this is actually a new design of a Quinjet, larger and more heavily armored than the stealth plane we saw at the start of the movie. These models were built specifically with heavier weapons to serve on the Project Insight helicarriers. And there's also a deleted scene that takes place right after this where Pierce announces,
"Captain America is a fugitive from S.H.I.E.L.D."
which further cements that Alexander Pierce is also part of this conspiracy. Now there was another deleted scene that was never filmed that would have actually featured Clint Barton right here. Joe Russo told Screen Rant that originally Hawkeye was going to be one of the agents chasing Cap through Washington, D.C. They planned a sequence where he confronts Steve at a ravine outside the city, and Steve pins him down, and that's when Clint whispers in his ear that he's actually trying to help him and that there is a tracker in his suit. Now Renner couldn't do the scene because he was filming American Hustle and Kill the Messenger. The writer said they also filmed a sequence where they said where Hawkeye was, but it wasn't used in the movie. In Age of Ultron, it's kind of implied that he was with his wife and kids. So all of this leads into another deleted scene where S.H.I.E.L.D. agents track down Steve's uniform with a tracker. Notice we actually have this like Doom-esque first-person shooter angle. But then they discover his uniform is in some random guy's gym bag, and this is why Steve is wearing a hoodie, sweatpants, and sneakers in the next scene. And also, metaphorically, this is Steve shedding the skin of that darker, morally gray suit, and molting into the colorful hero we see at the end of the film. So this takes him back to the hospital where Natasha tells him the spy ghost story of the Winter Soldier.
He's credited with over 24 assassinations in the last 50 years.
So he's a ghost story.
Then she shows him her scar, saying,
"Bye-bye bikinis."
But in Iron Man 2, we do see a photo of Natasha in lingerie, where we can see that she clearly does not have that scar. But the photo could have been taken before 2009 when the Winter Soldier shot her. Now, in the comics, Natasha actually had a romantic relationship with the Winter Soldier for years. In fact, years later, they retconned her origin story to say that she was actually decades old and they knew each other during the Cold War. Then Pierce does some clever politicking, tricking the World Security Council into doubling down on Project Insight and making them think that it's his idea.
This council moves to immediately reactivate Project Insight.
I think right here the movie is doing a great job of still making us think that the council could be the bad guys and Alexander Pierce could still be a hero. Steve and Natasha go to an Apple store to use the drive, and then the guy who helps them is played by D.C. Pearson, a veteran of the Donald Glover sketch group Derek Comedy, who also worked with the Russo brothers on the show Community.
Specimen.
And there was another deleted scene here where Sitwell shows the Apple Store cam footage to Maria Hill, and when she messes with him...
That's Captain America you're after. He tends to inspire a certain amount of loyalty.
He orders her off the assignment, and this is when Hill knows that Sitwell cannot be trusted. In this scene, she also says that she is planning Fury's funeral, which is probably why he has a gravestone at the end of the movie. On the escalator, the troops close in on them, and by the way, this is Joss Whedon and his son. So Steve wants to be tactical, like a soldier, while Natasha thinks like a spy.
Kiss me.
And then later on in the truck, she asks him,
"Where did Captain America learn how to steal a car?"
Which is a sly reference to this scene from the terrible 1990 Captain America movie.
Don't leave me out here!
And notice that she has her feet on the dash, a habit that we see her continue when she's at her desk in Avengers Endgame. And then she presses him.
Was that your first kiss since 1945?
And this conversation is similar to his discussion with Peggy in First Avenger.
Women aren't exactly lining up to dance with the guy they might step on.
So I think in this moment, Steve might even be thinking of Peggy, which is the real reason he doesn't date, because his heart belongs to someone else. But I should mention that in the show She-Hulk, Bruce Banner does confirm that Steve did lose his virginity on the USO tour.
Captain America!
And then she tells him to make up a new life for himself, saying,
"Truth is a matter of circumstance. It's not all things to all people, all the time."
And this is part of her journey in the movie and in the MCU. She begins the movie blindly following orders in a morally gray world. But at the end of the movie, she ends up revealing all of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s data, dumping a lot of objective truth onto the internet. Then they arrive at Camp Lehigh, where of course Steve trained in the first Avenger. And that camp also first appeared in the comic book The Adventures of Captain America, Sentinel of Liberty. Steve looks up at the flagpole, probably remembering the moment when he outsmarted everybody else and got her right back to base. Then he has a memory of his old drill instructor, and for a moment he watches himself in the past. Now, this sequence is a companion piece to the museum scene from earlier. Steve saw how his life moved on without him, and now he sees that after he left Camp Lehigh, the base continued to move on, with him being just a memory. Now, just like on the escalator, they have differing approaches. Natasha hits a wall when her science fails.
Zero heat signatures, zero waves, not even radio?
But Steve's military training gives him the answer.
Army regulations forbid storing munitions within 500 yards of the barracks. This building's in the wrong place.
So they find an early headquarters for S.H.I.E.L.D. with the same logo that we first saw in The Incredible Hulk. Now, in the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the team was eventually headquartered in an old SSR base similar to this office. And of course, Tony and Steve revisit this base in the 1970s in Avengers Endgame. Notice how each desk has a phone line running down from the ceiling. That's just a neat detail that I appreciate that I saw in the concept art. On the wall, we see pictures of his old commanding officer, Colonel Phillips, and Howard Stark, played by Dominic Cooper like he was in First Avenger. Now remember, older Howard Stark was played by John Slattery, who we saw in the 1970s in Endgame.
Well, I'm Howard Stark.
Now, this isn't a continuity error because notice Peggy's picture is still the younger version of Peggy. So I think they had these pictures up for years and then just never replaced them. But Steve seeing a picture of Peggy also sets up the scene in Avengers Endgame when Peggy looks at a picture of Steve. We can also assume that Steve and Tony must have also caught up and talked about this place from the way they talk about it together in Endgame.
We'll stroll down memory lane. Military installation, Garden State.
When were they both there?
They were there at a time, I have a vaguely exact idea.
And Natasha's playing with them when she asked,
Who's the girl?
because she would definitely know who Peggy Carter is because she is the woman who co-founded S.H.I.E.L.D. And then we enter our final secret elevator of the movie because it reveals the darkest secret of all. Hydra has actually been flourishing for decades. So this idea of Hydra being a beautiful parasite inside of S.H.I.E.L.D. is also lifted from the movie 3 Days of the Condor.
Somebody or something is rotten in the company.
Maybe there's another CIA inside the CIA.
And this revealed that Hydra is secretly controlling S.H.I.E.L.D. was a twist that first appeared in the comics in Secret Warriors issue 1. They discover a massive computer compound with data stored on magnetic tape. And I would estimate that all of this holds about as much as one Instagram photo. Wow, really? No, I'm kidding. But this question did lead me down a long Reddit post about this. Zola says he's on 200,000 feet of magnetic tape, which with 1970s technology would mean that this many reels could only store about 13 gigabytes. But the human brain is estimated to hold 4 terabytes of information, not counting all of the computing power used to create the algorithm. But it's the MCU, so let's just say that science was more advanced. Sony actually currently makes a magnetic tape that stores enough information for Zola to have 177,000 terabytes to work with. At the computer, Natasha says,
Shall we play a game?
Which is of course a reference to the movie War Games.
Shall we play a game?
But this reference is actually very apt. War Games is about a computer inadvertently starting nuclear war, and the Zola algorithm is about to kill millions of people. I should also note that Zola's appearance here is more comic accurate as a head inside a screen. And in the show What If, we see him finally get his body. So this Hydra reveal is at the exact center of the movie, and it's Steve's lowest point. This is his worst nightmare. All through the movie, he has been suffering from the consequences of his sacrifice. But now he finds out that his sacrifice never mattered. The montage where Zola reveals Hydra's existence seems heavily inspired by this brainwashing sequence from another 70s conspiracy thriller, The Parallax View. Natasha mentions that Zola was recruited as part of Operation Paperclip, a real-life program where the USA pardoned Nazis if they would help them go to the moon. And in the show Agent Carter, we actually saw Zola in the 1940s starting to rebuild Hydra.
And America is the land of opportunity.
Now, let's break down this archive. This image of Schmidt in front of Nazi soldiers is of course lifted from First Avenger, using footage from Erskine's montage to explain the Red Skull. This footage of the soldiers is taken directly from the First Avenger. And this footage of soldiers storming the beach is actually from the Philippines in 1945 and not Germany. I know this because I found it on Getty, but I'm not using the actual footage because they wanted us to pay them $1,000. This poster calling the Red Skull the Führer is not a real Nazi poster because it's in English. Then there's montage footage from First Avenger, spliced with newsreel footage of Wilhelm Keitel signing the Declaration of German Surrender. This is followed by animation of a bombing raid cut in with real footage, and then newsreel footage of a Hitler poster being burned with Nazi flags. This is a real photo from the Yalta Conference, and this is Captain America spliced into this image of surrendering Germans on D-Day. Now this is the memo consolidating the SSR into S.H.I.E.L.D. The logo transforms, however, goes to a negative image, and then we see Howard Stark in the HQ with Phillips and Peggy in the background. Then a shot of the Capitol building with the S.H.I.E.L.D. logo rotating on its end to show that Hydra is the inverse of S.H.I.E.L.D. as the Hydra logo slowly appears. And I love this detail. When you translate this German, you see that this is the original stamp that the Nazis used to create the Department of Hydra. It translates to Hydra Department through the agreement of the Führer. And this outer circle is Hydra's mission statement to use occult science: investigation, strong, energy, and truth. And all of this could be a reference to the Tesseract. After all, Schmidt's #1 goal was to find the Tesseract and then use its energy to create weapons. And this also pays off a reveal from the Avengers, when we find out that Phase 2 was to use the Tesseract to use old Hydra weapons. Even back then, Hydra's influence was guiding Nick Fury's actions. In the prequel comic, First Vengeance, we see Schmidt talking to Hitler about forming Hydra to find ancient Viking artifacts, including the Tesseract. And for a moment, the name Stark also flashes on the border of this seal where Führer used to be, because in effect, Howard Stark became head of Hydra when he was running S.H.I.E.L.D. And then we see Zola behind bars, just like in Agent Carter, followed by his security clearance and this real newspaper headlines of Germans being recruited to work for the US, but with Toby Jones inserted into the background. And then Zola runs Steve through the dark side of what he's missed. Now, Steve's notebook is all about the good stuff, the music, the fun, the disco. But this is everything terrible. So this is Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in East Berlin. We see a nuclear bomber, the Cuban Revolution, nuclear weapons launching from ships. This is Sandinista rebels. This guy looks like Bill Ayers, leader of the Weather Underground. This is followed by a shot of the Iranian Revolution, smart bombs, stock market plunges, and Muammar Gaddafi. Zola narrates that Hydra seeded war over the decades, trying to create a chaotic world and erode public trust in institutions. And this is followed by Mr. WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, then the Palestinian Uprising of 1987, which marks these certain people as Hydra operatives. This is just a crashed photo of a UPS plane. We see oil well fires during the Gulf War, POWs in the Gulf War, the stock market crash of '89, and then a glimpse of the Winter Soldier's arm. This photo of the Winter Soldier on a roof is modeled after his very first comic panel appearance. And notice that Winter Soldier is classified text that has been crossed out. And then Zola basically tells us that the Winter Soldier killed Howard Stark, using the photo of young Howard and not John Slattery for this newspaper headline. They probably just did this for continuity with the first Avenger. Now notice this article mentions that there are allegations that there was foul play. But an unnamed witness talks about how this happened so quickly. That unnamed witness must have been a Hydra plant because, as we see in Civil War, there was no witness to Howard and Maria Stark's deaths. The article also mentions Obadiah Stane, the Ironmonger from Iron Man 1, offering his thoughts and prayers. And over here we see that they have named Anthony Stark as their heir. Then they overlay the Winter Soldier on the Stark headline in case you missed that Bucky was the one who killed the Starks. Now this memo is addressed to G.W. Bridge, a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent from the comics who used to be on a team with Cable. And then we see Howard's name crossed out, only leaving Peggy Carter as the last founding member of S.H.I.E.L.D. who is alive. And I think this name on the left was Colonel Phillips who had been crossed out. Then we see a smart bomb dropping on Baghdad as Zola says the key line of the movie.
Hydra created a world so chaotic that humanity is finally ready to sacrifice its freedom.
And this is followed by images of our national security state. Surveillance cameras, PIN numbers that turn into Hydra logos. The implication is that Hydra is watching everything we do, and all of this information feeds into their algorithm. And they're watching us from the Project Insight satellites. So this question, freedom versus fear, isn't just the theme of this movie. It's actually a slippery slope that we have been moving down for decades, especially after 9/11 when the Patriot Act gave the FBI sweeping authority to wiretap citizens. We allow ourselves to be searched at the airport, and we all kind of live with the knowledge that our data is being bought and sold by data brokers. But to Steve Rogers, who just got here from 1945, all of this would seem horrifying. Zola explains that the algorithm is the final conclusion to all of this data, a way to violently create
New World Order,
which was the original title of Captain America: Brave New World. And finally, I want to point out that Arnim Zola missed out on his true calling as a video editor. This montage is very well made. When Steve punches the screen, another Zola head appears, and it's just reinforcing what he already said, that Hydra will always regenerate.
Cut off one head, two more shall take its place.
And this, of course, is a motto inspired by the monster Hydra from Greek mythology. During this scene, Steve goes behind the screen, almost like he's looking for the man behind the curtain. Remember, he's a big Wizard of Oz guy.
Personal flying monkeys. Do not understand.
I do. I understood that reference.
Zola reveals that Hydra has been destroying S.H.I.E.L.D.'s past for years, so it's fitting that the Hydra missile literally destroys S.H.I.E.L.D.'s history, its original building. But this is a watershed moment for Steve. It is the moment of the movie where he realizes that he can no longer live in the past. Afterwards, Steve and Natasha escape, but the concept art revealed a much more dramatic shot, which seemed inspired by this famous John Byrne X-Men cover, which was later imitated by George Perez on this cover from Crisis on Infinite Earths. And of course, all of them are imitating Michelangelo's The Pieta. And then we go to the Alexander Pierce reveal scene. Now notice that when he opens his refrigerator door, we see a bottle of Newman's Own Dressing, a brand that was started by Paul Newman, who was Redford's co-star in films like The Sting and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So this scene where he discovers the Winter Soldier waiting on him is a deliberate callback to Robert Redford waiting on the shadowy CIA operative in the movie 3 Days of the Condor. So this callback makes us expect for Redford to once again be the good guy here, until he says,
The timetable is moved. Our window is limited.
Now, in the audio commentary, the Russo brothers talked about the greater meaning that this scene has.
Someone comes into a place thinking they'll be alone and somebody is already there, which is slightly symbolic of the fact that Hydra has been there all along.
And while the Winter Soldier shows up unannounced, so does Steve.
We need a place to lay low.
Everyone we know is trying to kill us.
In fact, the scene of Steve and Natasha showing up at Sam's apartment to recruit him is also taken from 3 Days of the Condor, when Robert Redford forces his way into Faye Dunaway's apartment. Now, this is actually one of the most crucial scenes in the movie because it is grounding for the characters. The Russo brothers shot the scene using long lenses, so only the actors are in focus, and like the rest of the film, it's shot handheld to give it a documentary style that makes the characters feel more real. Also, in this scene, Steve is never in the frame by himself. They are always shooting dirty with another character in the edge of the frame. So this is subtly showing us that Steve is no longer alone. Now, this is also an important scene for Natasha. It's when she begins to turn from being an instrument of the state to becoming a free thinker.
When I first joined S.H.I.E.L.D., I thought I was going straight. But I guess I just traded in the KGB for Hydra.
This foreshadows her info-dumping S.H.I.E.L.D. secrets on the internet at the end of the movie, but also her turn on Iron Man in Captain America Civil War. And it also shows us that she is always looking for a way to redeem her past sins, setting up her eventual sacrifice in Avengers Endgame. When Sam shows them his wings, she mentions Bakhmala, a city in Afghanistan where Sam and Riley nabbed a terrorist. Now, the wings are being kept at Fort Meade, which is about an hour outside of DC. In the first draft of the screenplay, Sam was actually just going to fly by and nab Sitwell, but the gradual reveal works way better and is also replicated from 3 Days of the Condor. Redford gets to Cliff Robertson by using Faye Dunaway as a proxy, just like how Steve and Natasha use Sam. Sitwell is talking to Senator Stearns, you know, the pain in Tony's ass from Iron Man 2.
Priority is to get the Iron Man weapon turned over to the people of the United States of America.
Well, you can forget it.
And now we know why Stearns wanted that Iron Man armor so bad. He is played by the great comedian Gary Shandling, creator of The Larry Sanders Show. Sitwell name drops some Easter eggs, you know, potential names for Zola's algorithm.
Bruce Banner, Stephen Strange, anyone who's a threat.
But remember, this was also released 2 years before Stephen Strange's car accident occurred in the MCU. So at this point, Zola's algorithm just read Stephen as an exceptional person who could be a threat someday. In fact, there's another fun connection to Iron Man 2 here. Just before Stephen's accident, he is looking at a particular case.
I've got a 35-year-old Air Force colonel, crushed his lower spine in some kind of experimental armor, mid-thoracic burst fracture.
Now, the going theory is that this soldier who was wounded is actually this guy in Iron Man 2, getting his spine snapped in Justin Hammer's armor. And remember, Justin Hammer was designing this armor at the behest of Senator Stearns. And by the way, if you want to get into the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., there is a terrific arc that takes place in a computer simulation where Hydra actually wins. And then we get the best fight in the movie, the freeway fight. It begins when the Winter Soldier tosses Sitwell into the same Penske rental truck from earlier, which the Russos joked was driven by the Punisher, a man with an agenda. And notice this awesome detail from Canadian Lad. Natasha listens to Bucky on the roof, so then she's able to dodge his shots, and then she pushes both Steve and Sam out of the way of his next 2 shots. Now, when Bucky rips off the steering wheel and door, Steve then uses his shield to protect everybody from impact and keep them safe, showing again how Bucky and Steve are polar opposites who end up canceling each other out. Now, the Russos talked about how this sequence was actually inspired by the bank heist in Michael Mann's film Heat. In Heat, the scene is about a bank heist gone wrong that spills into a shootout in the street. In that scene, you slowly feel the noose tighten around the crooks as the cops close in tighter and tighter, which is exactly what happens to Steve and Natasha and Sam in this scene. Now, to imitate the feel of that movie, they shot everything over the shoulder with long lenses to create intimacy in this shaky cam feel. Now, one of the reasons this sequence feels so real is because the stunt team worked hand in hand with the camera team. So each movement was articulated through the perfect camera movement.
So by the time we got to set, we had a very complete stunt viz of the sequence, which made it much easier and quicker to shoot it.
So going back to Natasha listening to Bucky on the roof, the fight is filled with little details that show her attention to everything happening around her. For instance, when she's running away, she sees Bucky's shadow on the overpass ahead, so she knows to run for cover. And then she turns around and nails him right in the eye, but his protective goggles saved his life. Now, Sebastian Stan's famous knife flip was not CGI. He actually trained with the knife to get that move down pat.
I was just kind of like walking around the house for a while, just sort of flipping this plastic knife. I mean, I was like driving in intersections and just flipping it in the car.
5, 6, 7. Oh, yes, that was nutty.
Now, Hydra normally uses the Winter Soldier in secret, under cover of darkness, but in this movie, they call him out twice in broad daylight because, like, this is the mission for them. They have spent 70 years building up to the success of Project Insight. Everything is on the line. Now, remember how I told you that originally the movie was going to open in World War II and show Cap standing up against a machine gun, but the Russos moved that sequence to the climax of Act 2 right here. Now, the big plot hole you see on the internet is that Steve is able to deflect the bullets back at the gun. Technically, he shouldn't be able to do that. After all, in First Avenger, we saw Peggy fire bullets at the shield, and then the vibranium stopped them cold. Because, as we learned, the shield absorbs vibrations. But the shield does not absorb all vibrations, or it would never make a sound.
Vibranium. It's stronger than steel.
And also, the shield does not necessarily absorb all kinetic energy. Like, if an object is moving fast enough, it could bounce off the shield. For instance, a Gatling gun like this fires bullets at a top range of 3,000 feet per second, way more than the 750 feet per second of Agent Carter's sidearm in First Avenger. So it is possible that the bullets could bounce off the shield instead of falling down flat in front of Cap. And notice in this scene that Bucky has other Hydra agents whose only job is to stand there with a grenade launcher ready to hand it to Bucky, kind of like a squire helping out a knight during a joust. On the audio commentary, the Russos confirmed that originally Natasha was supposed to fake out the Winter Soldier by leaving her boots on the ground behind the car. But then Scarlett Johansson pointed out that Natasha would then be barefoot for the rest of the fight. So they changed the decoy to her phone, which works a lot better. And then she and the Winter Soldier face off for their rematch. Remember, they encountered each other years before, and she tries using her Widow Flip in a chokehold. But Bucky sees the move coming, so she has to settle for throwing a stun disc at his arm to temporarily disable the electronics. Now, the fight between Steve and Bucky in this scene is gritty and grounded, just like the fist fight we see in 3 Days of the Condor. When Bucky punches the shield, the image is taken straight from the comics and also is replicated in the concept art for the movie. And for a moment, Bucky holds the shield just like he did in First Avenger. And notice how here the shield is dark and gray, symbolic of how Hydra has tainted the shield. And when Steve sees his face and calls him by his name, Bucky says,
"Who the hell is Bucky?"
And this line is taken straight from the comics. And then, just like in Captain America Civil War, Steve is arrested. But I like that at this moment, Rumlow does not want Cap to have bad press.
Put the gun down. Not here. Not here.
In spite of their different circumstances, he respects Cap as a fellow soldier. Then after Maria Hill rescues them, she takes him to an off-the-books black site, similar to the one that Nick Fury set aside for Hawkeye's farm in Age of Ultron. Now, we learned that Fury faked his death by using a drug that slowed his heart rate that was designed by Bruce Banner.
Tetrodotoxin B slows the pulse to 1 beat a minute. Banner developed it for stress.
And remember, at the beginning of The Incredible Hulk, Bruce was learning to control his heart rate to prevent himself from hulking out. And also, Joe Russo cameos once again as the doctor who sedated Nick Fury in the operating room, which then leads to my favorite cameo of the movie. They shot the Winter Soldier brainwash scene in a bank vault in Cleveland, and according to New Rockstars, this is the same bank the Cap jumps out of in the Avengers movie. Now, the bank vault could also be a callback to the opening of the film Marathon Man, which the Russos cited as a key influence on this film. But back to the cameo, one of the doctors is played by Ed Brubaker, the creator of the Winter Soldier in the comics. And the other Hydra scientist is character actor Pat Healy, who you might remember as Jeff from Better Call Saul. Now, the visual here of Bucky being brainwashed surrounded by screens is straight out of the comics. But according to the Russo brothers, they were also heavily inspired by Han Solo's torture scene in The Empire Strikes Back. Now, both scenes don't really show a lot of torture, they just cut away with the lingering scream in the background in order to spare the children.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
And there's also a tie-in here with the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. In Season 2, we learned that Hydra was mind-controlling people with a Faustus machine, which used a screen to brainwash its subjects. And by the way, this also ties back to Dr. Faustus, the villain in Agent Carter Season 1, who was recruited by Arnim Zola in the Season 1 finale.
And America is the land of opportunity.
And we also see Zola's human body in this flashback sequence, showing us how Bucky became the Winter Soldier. Now, this is an abbreviated version of the comic book flashback, which showed his accident, his capture, and him turning on his handlers, just like we see here. And we also see Bucky frozen in the same status pods that we see in Captain America Civil War. Again, this is the opposite of Steve Rogers. Steve entered a pod and then gained new powers and a new life, but every time Bucky enters a pod, he loses a piece of his life. Fury's secret base was actually at a sewage treatment plant. Now, they scouted the location in the wintertime, but by the time they filmed in the summer, the stench was apparently unbearable. And when they find him, Fury explains why he kept his survival a secret.
I wasn't sure who to trust.
Now notice they cut to Natasha, showing how much this sentence hurts her. You know, that Fury didn't know if he could trust her. And there's actually a deleted scene that follows up on this. Fury gives Natasha the disguise that she wears later in the film, and he tells her,
I had to keep the circle small.
And she replies,
I know. That's a problem.
which actually shows how she does not feel good about being a spy and keeping secrets. This not only sets up her revealing all of her secrets later in the film, but also why she expands her circle to become a full-time Avenger in Age of Ultron. Steve remembers the aftermath of his mother's funeral, giving us our second callback to skinny Steve Rogers in this film. Now Bucky, helping Steve with his grief, is also called back in Civil War when he tells him,
"Your mom's name is Sarah."
And this reminded me a lot of the classic issue Avengers number 277, when the Masters of Evil took over Avengers Mansion and destroyed the only picture that Steve had of his mother. Bucky tells him,
"We can put the couch cushions on the floor like when we were kids."
Which is how we see Bucky sleeping on the floor in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now afterwards, Sam says,
"Whoever he used to be, and the guy he is now, I don't think he's the kind you save. He's the kind you stop."
Which is paraphrasing what Sharon said about Bucky in the comics when she told Steve that he couldn't save him. But, you know, in many ways, all of this bad stuff happening is really good for Steve. He is a soldier, and he finally knows who he is, and more importantly, who he has to fight. He rips off his suit from the Smithsonian, getting Stan Lee in big trouble.
Oh, man. I am so fired.
And then we see his World War II suit in its full, colorful glory. Now, the Russos intentionally stripped the color out of this film just so this one moment would pop on screen. Notice the shield's colors are no longer muted to reflect that Steve now has mental clarity. And this is also the film's first prominent use of the color red. When you look at this reproduction of the film's color palette from moviepalettes.com, you can see how it began more in the shadows and more dim. But at this point, the movie is brought into the light. And I also like that Steve stopped and took the time to really shine up his shield before going into his last big battle. Black Widow arrives at the Triskelion disguised as Holly, blaming her delay on a delayed flight. And the electronic mask that she uses also appears in later seasons of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. In fact, a malfunctioning mask allowed Ming-Na Wen to play two roles, both as Mayday and a disfigured Hydra assassin. God, when that show was good, it was good. Now back at the Triskelion, we get a cameo from Danny Pudi, one of the stars of the show Community, which, remember, the Russo brothers were directors and executive producers of for the first 3 seasons. Danny Pudi plays a character named Abed who is obsessed with movies, pop culture, and superheroes.
I am Batman. Or am I? Yes, I am Batman.
But his inclusion in this movie is such a meta gag because there is an episode where Abed talks about being a background actor on the show Cougar Town.
If I'm a person that watches Cougar Town, how can I be in Cougar Town? My hands and my feet went numb, my knees buckled. As I fell to the floor, I pooped my pants.
And then Danny Pudi did appear in the background of Cougar Town playing Abed right here, where he runs off to use the bathroom. So Danny Pudi's cameo here plays like he's Abed getting cast in The Winter Soldier.
Ow! Must be the dish. I'll check it out.
And I should also note that in another episode of Community, Jeff and Annie whisper that they don't really like Marvel movies.
Flavorless, unremarkable Marvel movies.
Oh, they are so not a big deal.
I know!
It's just all there is.
Which is Dan Harmon's way of poking fun at the Russo brothers' new directing gig. And there's another really important Community Easter egg in this sequence. Cameron Klein, the brave guy who stands up to Hydra, is played by Aaron Himmelstein, who is the rival debater in Season 1 of Community. Klein also returns in Age of Ultron and is name-dropped in the Infinity War post-credits scene.
Tell Klein we'll meet him at...
Now, Hydra's ultimate plan to wipe out millions of troublemakers is actually just like their plan in First Avenger when Red Skull wanted to drop nukes on all the major cities in the world. And by the way, shout out to the blog MCU Location Scout who went through every single Hydra target listed. We'll break down those for you right now. First, there is Maria Hill, who, look, is actually undercover in the Triskelion. So technically, Project Insight would have inadvertently destroyed its own headquarters and killed Hydra head Alexander Pierce. I guess everybody would have been better off if Steve Rogers just did nothing. And then we see that President Matthew Ellis is in the Capitol building. Now remember, Ellis first appeared in Iron Man 3, but he also made a cameo in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and several Marvel digital shorts. There are also 2 random names, Lieutenant Marcus Bledsoe in the Pentagon, and Michael Linden in Elliott Mills Middle School. And then we get the big cameo, Tony Stark in the newly renovated Avengers Tower. And this is also the first time we see the tower as the new Avengers headquarters. Now, when Sharon disobeys orders, Rumlow pulls a knife to take control of the console, which is actually a metaphor for what Hydra is doing. They use subterfuge to take control of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, the climax of the movie with Steve Rogers infiltrating a ship to stop Project Insight was actually foreshadowed by the opening of the movie where Steve breaks into a ship so Natasha can steal Project Insight. Steve gives his big hero speech setting off the civil war within S.H.I.E.L.D.
I know I'm asking a lot. The price of freedom is high. Always has been. And it's a price I'm willing to pay. And if I'm the only one, then so be it. But I'm willing to bet I'm not.
Now, the third act of the movie is structured a lot like Return of the Jedi, with action occurring in different places with different stakes at the same time. We've got the big battle against the super weapon, a secondary battle, a face-off with the leader of the villains, but it's all focused on a personal fight between two men. And this is where we finally get to see the Falcon in his full gear, which is loaded with tiny design details. His suit is called an Exo 7 prototype because it's a pun on the French name Exocet, which is the name of a type of flying fish that has shiny wings. The Russos and their design team were worried about Sam's look because it would be easy for him to look silly, flapping his wings.
I never loved his costume. I always thought it was sort of too 70s inspired,
On the channel Made in Hollywood, Joe Russo said that they wanted the Falcon to look like a human fighter jet.
It's a deadly bird. He's a weapon in his own right, so he has to operate with the efficiency of a weapon.
Anthony Mackie and the artist wanted to have a realistic idea of how it felt and looked to freefall, so he had an unusual training regimen.
I did a lot of diving into swimming pools. It's a lot of effects and CGI, but also it's a lot of me and my stunt guy, Aaron Toney, just flying around on cables.
So they went through several different concepts, some with more camo, some with armor where he wears a shield on his face. Now that would actually be more practical for him flying at high speeds, but then we wouldn't get to see Anthony Mackie actually emote. And for the wings, they didn't want him to just glide. The goal was to make him more maneuverable than Iron Man. So at one point, they considered a version that would have been made from recovered Chitauri tech, but then they worked with other versions that were so thin they actually looked like canvas. Now, even though the wings are completely digital, they did create small wings to use as a digital reference to show how they would reflect in sunlight. The design they decided on was more of a canvas Kevlar mesh that would be easy to retract but still look cool. But the real challenge was how was Sam going to fire his pistols? Like, Sam's arms are inside of his wings. So at one point they designed a version where his guns were planted at the edge of his wings. But what they ended up settling on was giving Sam attachment points where he can slide retractable guns onto his wrists. And notice that when this happens, his wings go rigid and his guns pop out so he can glide while shooting. And then the guns are activated when he moves his arms forward. It not only looks cool, but it has the quick draw aesthetic of a gunslinger. Meanwhile, Natasha makes her move, revealing her fake face. And there's a cool detail here when she's deactivating the mask. For a moment, they de-aged the actress playing Holly before meshing her face with Scarlett Johansson's, and then finally revealing that it's been Natasha all along. What? But also notice that the mask changes the skin on her arm. Somehow. In fact, the way she strips off the mask is the opposite of First Avenger when the Red Skull reveals his true face. In one movie, the head of Hydra is revealing his face to the hero, and in this one, the hero is revealing her true face to the head of Hydra. And here's another parallel to the first Avenger. Steve rescued Bucky on a catwalk in a Hydra base. And in this movie, he fights Bucky on another catwalk in a different Hydra base. The dome at the bottom of the carrier is actually a surveillance hub equipped with hundreds of cameras. And the architecture on this underbelly is very similar to the Valkyrie, the Hydra ship from First Avenger. This is appropriate since Hydra was hiding its true self beneath S.H.I.E.L.D. for decades.
Huh?
Now, when Bucky and Steve are grappling, notice how the metal in his arm tenses and flexes, almost like a robotic version of real muscles.
And we want to pump you up.
And, in keeping with how everything in this movie has a dark shadow, the Winter Soldier has a grappling hook, just like Natasha. He uses it to bring Sam down, and honestly, I'm glad Sam lost this fight, because it is his first mission. Of course he should lose.
He's out of line, but he's right.
But then, he also did lose to Ant-Man later on.
It's really important to me that Cap never finds out about this.
But instead of beating the world's greatest assassin, he has to face off against Rumlow. When Rumlow removes his jacket, the straps on his chest look like the Crossbones logo from the comics, showing his gradual transformation into this comic book villain. Now, when Sam and Rumlow punch each other, they cut away. And the Russo brothers said that this was a direct inspiration from the ending of Rocky II, where we don't get to see who won Apollo and Rocky's rematch. Meanwhile, in Pierce's throne room at the top of the Triskelion, Fury arrives, his trench coat flowing, replicating his entrance from the Avengers.
I look good. I mean, really good.
Pierce tries to justify his decision and even foreshadows some future MCU stories.
Just a matter of time before a dirty bomb goes off in Moscow or an EMP fries Chicago.
He also says that Fury's actions in Bogota are what inspired him to join Hydra. So in a way, Fury's unilateral action is the original sin of S.H.I.E.L.D.
You screwed the pooch hard.
big time.
This is when Fury reveals that he still has both eyes, which, we already knew after watching Captain Marvel. Now you gotta respect this though, that for decades, Fury kept his eye a secret from everyone in his life. Once Natasha gets access, she dumps all of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s secrets, and there's a deleted scene where Pierce actually spells out some of her past sins.
If you do this, none of your past is going to remain hidden. Not Budapest, not Osaka, not the children's ward.
Jeez, that's heavy. Yeah, I know. They probably cut that scene because Natasha is a character who we put on cereal boxes, and you don't want an Avenger to be a known child murderer. Again, Natasha revealing S.H.I.E.L.D. secrets to the public is like the end of 3 Days of the Condor when Redford goes to the New York Times with the CIA cover-up story. But Pierce waits till after Hydra's secrets are dumped to activate the name tags and kill the Council. Or why did he wait? Maybe he secretly wanted people to know that Hydra was in control because he was tired of living in the shadows. I mean, this may have been Hydra's plan all along. When they assumed control, they were going to tell everybody they were Hydra. But then Natasha uses her Widow Stunner to disable the name tag and get the drop on Pierce. And then we go for the fight with the Emperor to the final matchup between Bucky and Steve. So he chokes Bucky out. And remember, in Avengers Endgame, when he's fighting himself, he remembers this moment, which is why he gets the idea to say, "Bucky is alive!" And then he breaks Bucky's human arm, meaning that all he has left are his machine parts, like Obi-Wan said.
He's more machine now than man, twisted and evil.
Also notice how, in this final battle, their seats fully contrast each other. Steve is wearing bright primary colors, while Bucky is all black and silver with a tiny hint of red on his arm. While on Steve's shoulder, we see a star instead of the S.H.I.E.L.D. logo, symbolizing his full transformation away from Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, in Age of Ultron and Civil War, this is replaced with an Avengers patch, which is then stripped away in his Nomad suit for Infinity War. You see, because Steve is a soldier, a lot of his identity is tied directly to his uniform. So Steve uses the helicarrier climbing skills he learned in the Avengers to insert the disc just in time, shaking off a few bullet holes in his flesh.
I've had worse.
Back at the control center, the order comes down.
Fire when ready.
Just like in A New Hope.
You may fire when ready.
What? The Insight carriers then target themselves. And think about the symbolism here. A Hydra is a monster with many heads that constantly regrow. So, how do you kill a Hydra? Have the heads devour themselves. But there are also little details in this fight, like how the Hydra guns are tri-barreled and they all fire slightly offset from each other. See, every step of the way, the Russo brothers asked themselves, well, how would this work if we had to build it in real life? For instance, the bottom helicarrier receives the most damage of the three. In a deleted scene from Spider-Man Homecoming, we actually do get to see the aftermath of this battle.
They're still cleaning up from when Captain America took down those skycraft carriers for no reason?
Now, at some point, Black Widow got back on the helicopter with Fury and then changed into her S.H.I.E.L.D. jumpsuit. Because, I seriously doubt if she was wearing that suit underneath the suit she was wearing before.
Wagyu steak. I'm a pork chop.
Now, this is one of my favorite action beats in the movie because Sam does not have his wings. He's just a normal guy who is right to be afraid that he'll miss this jump. After Steve accomplishes his mission, he could make a clean getaway, but he decides to stay when he hears Bucky scream. Remember, he already listened to Bucky scream and fall once. And that moment has haunted him for decades, so he decides to stay.
I'm not leaving!
Once again, just like in First Avenger, Steve is in a Hydra ship that's going down, but this time his friend is here to save him. That's what friends are for. He drops the shield, foreshadowing the ending of Civil War, and his kindness finally penetrates Bucky's programming.
Because I'm with you to the end of the line.
And by the way, the scene where he tells him to shoot is also lifted from the comics. So the shot of Steve falling into the Potomac is the only slow motion shot in the movie, because this is a moment of surrender for Steve. He knows that he has accomplished his mission. He brought down Hydra and he stuck by his friend.
Friendship, power, perseverance. Yeah.
When he wakes up in the hospital, we get a fun callback to the opening.
On your left.
As then we go into a montage of the aftermath. Maria Hill goes to work for Tony Stark, but as a spy for Nick Fury. Fury sets fire to all of his spy stuff, but as we see in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., he still mops up Hydra afterwards.
I'll be everywhere.
Now, we also have a theory that this is when Fury goes into space and lets Talos take over his identity, and that the Fury we see in Age of Ultron is actually a Skrull.
Here we all are, back on Earth, with nothing but our wit and our will to save the world.
And Natasha testifying in front of Congress is embracing the new might makes right philosophy that Tony Stark displayed to Congress in Iron Man 2.
I have successfully privatized world peace.
Here, she's basically telling the government that superheroes are in control and try to stop them.
You're not gonna put me in a prison. You're not gonna put any of us in a prison.
And this perfectly sets up Age of Ultron, where the hubris of the Avengers leads to the destruction of an entire country, and also to their eventual breakup in Captain America: Civil War. Fury's False Grave features a fictional biblical passage taken from Samuel L. Jackson's famous speech in Pulp Fiction.
The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the inequities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men.
And this is just one of Fury's false graves. We actually saw another one in Secret Invasion, hiding the secret sauce of the Avengers' DNA.
What's the secret sauce? Thousand Island dressing.
The scene of Steve at a grave is also lifted from the Winter Soldier comics, where he finds that the graves of his war buddies have been desecrated. Now, the minimalist end credits were made by main title director Aaron Sorofsky, and they were created to combine the pop art sensibility of comic book creator Jim Steranko, who had a legendary run on Nick Fury: Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., combined with the style of Saul Bass, who designed sequences for classics like North by Northwest, Psycho, Cape Fear, and Man with a Golden Arm. For these credits, designer Aaron Sorofsky chose a minimalist design of red, white, and black. Now, of course, these are the colors of the Winter Soldier, but they also express the film's theme of contrasting opposites and how Steve is trying to break away from the morally gray world to see the world in terms of good and evil. So let's break down these end credits because, frankly, they are a beautiful piece of art that perfectly summarizes the movie. We start with Steve in silhouette, setting up this color scheme, black, white, and red. And these stripes also mimic the stripes of the American flag, the stripes on Steve's uniform, and the institutions of government, such as the Lincoln Memorial that opens up the movie. Then we see the split of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Hydra, with Steve's opposite being a Hydra soldier. Then this flips to reveal a helicarrier. And notice, we can't tell if this view is from above or below the carrier. Like, we can't tell if it's being controlled by Hydra or S.H.I.E.L.D. More stripes become the chemtrails of Quinjets, which turn into what we think are gears, the machinery of government, but then it turns out to secretly be the tentacles of Hydra. And then the white is overtaken by red, the color of Hydra and the Red Skull. And then we see Steve in this tunnel that is very influenced by the art of Jim Steranko. Notice how he's off balance, like he can't find his footing, and the only thing that's white in this frame is his shield, representing the purity of his ideals. And then that shield breaks through the pillars of Hydra, finally cracking the screen itself. But the Winter Soldier is also casting the shadow of an American flag, showing there's still just a little bit of Bucky Barnes left inside of him. But then the image shifts to red to show how Hydra has overtaken his mind and his subconscious. When the Falcon flies, he creates chemtrails that look like the stripes of the American flag, you know, like the stripes that begin with Steve in this opening. And Frank Grillo's title shows multiple cells with his chest straps, kind of similar to the Hydra soldiers in the first Avenger. Peggy appears on Steve's compass, Zola is on his reel-to-reels, but my favorite animation is reserved for Robert Redford. He is overseeing a crooked American flag, and as the stripes enter the S.H.I.E.L.D. logo, they turn red and jagged, like the wiring on a circuit board, symbolizing Zola's algorithm. And then that algorithm reaches out for Fury, since him discovering the program is what kicked the plot into motion. Now, the mid-credits scene, of course, debuts Wanda and Pietro Maximoff. Baron von Strucker is a Nick Fury and Captain America adversary from the comics, first appearing in Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos issue 5. He was later updated to be the head of Hydra in the pages of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. The scientist he's speaking to is named List. Now, he also appeared in Age of Ultron, but he even had a cameo in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the episode that broadcast right before that movie's release. Strucker calls this,
"This is the age of miracles, Doctor."
I don't know if you guys remember, this was back when Marvel Studios didn't have the rights to use the word mutant in their movies.
Like a mutation.
So, miracles became a kind of mocking phrase for these enhanced individuals. The Russo brothers said that the ending of the movie was like the fall of the Soviet Union. After the USSR disintegrated, their nuclear arsenal was suddenly in the hands of smaller satellite states. In the same way, the fall of Hydra means that these new nukes, metahumans, were free to roam the world. And of course, this metaphor continues in Captain America: Civil War, when Ross compares Bruce Banner and Thor to nuclear warheads.
If I misplaced a couple of 30-megaton nukes, you can bet there'd be consequences.
And that movie also pays off what happens when a dangerous, unchecked individual like Wanda Maximoff is released into the world.
She's not a U.S. citizen, and they don't grant visas to weapons of mass destruction. She's a kid. Give me a break!
And then, in the final credit scene, we go to Bucky at the Smithsonian trying to piece together who he is. Now notice that they completely replaced the Steve mannequin that used to have his uniform, and there's a different security guard, implying that old Stan Lee did indeed get canned.
Oh, man. I am so fired.
Well guys, that's our breakdown of the Winter Soldier. It's taken us like 5 months to finish this because we want it to be as thorough as possible for you. But we're gonna do a lot more of these because I love breaking down classic MCU and digging really deep into how they made these amazing movies. Huge shout out to the entire team who put this video together. Hey, and please let me know which MCU films you want us to break down next in the comments or on Twitter, Blue Sky Threads, or on our free to join Discord server. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.